Now we want to look at something called an instance method. Those are the methods or functions, if you would, that are inside of a class definition. And when we create an object, it gets those instant methods copied to it. So that way it's unique to that instance of that object. Hence the term an instance method. Let's see how we're going to create those using the class that we already worked with. Here's our public class called Planet, and notice we still have two private variables. These instance variables are accessible anywhere inside of our class, but we need a way to access them because we can't access them outside of our class object because they're both private. And this is the most common form of an instance method that you're going to find. You're going to find what we call getters and setters, where we're going to set a value or we're going to get a value. So I'm going to say public because I want anybody to be able to get this information. String get message. And you'll notice right away a couple very simple things. First off is, obviously it's public. Secondly, it has a return type that's the same type as the data object that I'm using. Finally, we commonly say get for our getters and then our instance variable name, or something that could be reasonably facsimilated to it. So it doesn't have to be an exact match. We might have called it MSG instead of message, just because we were really shorthanded, but we'd want to say get message so that our code is essentially self-documenting. In this case, you're seeing an error because I'm not returning a value yet. So I'm going to say return this dot message. And that's going to take our message, it's going to return it. So this return is going to return a string, and that means that our error has gone away. Let's look at the setter. I can say something like public void, because I'm not returning a value, set message, and then I'm going to take a string as a parameter, and I'm going to call this message. Notice it's the same name as my instance variable name. I'm going to show you how we're going to get around that in just a second. The first thing we want to know is that our setter is often going to have a little bit of error detection in it. We want to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for failure. So I'm going to come in here and do something like if message is not equal to null. Okay, I don't want to set my message to null. That would be bad. Okay, so in this case, by saying if message not equal to null, now inside of that, because I know I'm not null, I can set that value. However, my instance variable name and my parameter name are exactly the same. So how do I differentiate them? Well, I'll say this dot message, and anytime I specify this, I'm talking about my instance variable. It just makes it really simple and clear. So this dot message equals message. And because all I said was message, that means the local variable to that method. In this case, it came from a parameter. And so that's how I can differentiate them. Now, some people will say, oh, this is new message, or this is MSG, and they'll do some sort of abbreviation, or message 2. I find this to be a little bit more clear. A lot of your editors, like Visual Studio Code, will tell you what the parameter name is. And so you get a little bit better, clearer chance to see it, just in case something was a little bit confusing. So here's a real simple example of how we can do this. Now, sometimes we're going to have things that we want to get but not set. For example, the location. So I'm going to say public int get location, return this dot location, and I'm good there. But notice I'm not putting a setter, and I don't have to. I don't have to have a getter or a setter. I can have them both, one without the other. Doesn't actually matter. Sometimes I will have a parameter that doesn't have a getter and setter. It's used internally for something else. Maybe it's just the way I store things, and it doesn't have to be accessed. So you don't have to always have a getter and setter for every private property. Keep that in mind as well. Now, my other methods don't have to be just getters and setters. I could have something completely different. And I could do whatever I want inside of there. I can return a value, not return a value. Now, typically, what I'm going to do is an action that is for that object. What would that object do? Okay, so I have properties about it, and I have actions that it can perform. So, for example, I might have something like public void new day. You might think, okay, well, what is this going to do? Notice I'm not returning anything. I'm not taking any parameters. Well, in here, I could do something like system.out println another rotation, another day. So I'm just kind of printing a little something that a planet would do. A planet's going to have to rotate as it goes around in its orbit. It rotates on its axis. Each time it does a rotation, it's a new day. Now, may I have properties in here that help me tell a little bit more about that? Like, for example, how long is a rotation around its axis? Yes, I could. I might have a property that tells me about how long is this orbit, and I could talk about that. I have a lot of different properties, and maybe sometimes I use that information to bring me a little bit closer, and I can do calculations based upon, another day. I'm 1/365th closer to being back to where I started. Or I could say another day is another 24 hours. I don't have that information here, so I'm not using it. This method is just an example of something that's not a getter or setter. That, like I said, doesn't mean I can't use other properties. I can't combine properties. I can't do calculations. It all depends upon what your object is capable of doing. And if it's capable of doing some big thing, it may take a lot of those properties, or it might take a lot of parameters. You don't know. So always keep those things in mind. And that's what these Java methods are all about, is they're just functions that allow us to do different things. Now, those things might be a physical thing, like a planet spinning on its axis, or it could be something like an abstract thing, such as a printer object, and it's going to clear out its queue of printed items. So keep those things in mind. It's very, very flexible with what you can do and gives you a lot of power in order to do object-oriented programming. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like just so I know, and consider subscribing.